Thank you so much, Leslie. It's wonderful to be here in Madison. You guys are wonderful hosts. I really enjoyed my time here. I haven't been in Madison since I was about 8 or 9 years old, and it's really fun to be back. So I want to give a huge thanks to Leslie, who's my mentor and friend, also to the Africa at Noon series and the African Studies Department here, who have been so gracious in putting this talk together. So today I'm going to be talking about my co-authored book, co-authored with my co-researcher and co-writer, Amanda Poole. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different with my talk. I'm trying to do something highly experimental, which is either going to be really great or it's going to fall flat on its face. Following a brief introduction to give you some context for our research in our book, I'm going to make this talk interactive, sort of like, do you guys remember like choose your own adventure books? So it's going to be sort of a little bit like that. And I have to acknowledge that choose your own adventure books are sort of a frivolous form, and I don't want to make light of my subject matter, which is very, very, very serious. But I'm choosing this format both to make the talk a little bit more interactive, but also because I think it will walk you through the decision tree and the choices that refugees have to make, and hopefully increase a sense of empathy and a sense of what it would really feel like to put yourself in these shoes. All right, now I have to remember to advance my slides. Oops. I'm not the most technological person. All right, so I'm going to start my talk as we start our book with a dilemma, a choice that a refugee that we call Habtum posed to us early on in our field work. This is the way we start our book as well. We met Habtum in the Hitsats refugee camp in Northern Ethiopia. He'd fled the dictatorship in Eritrea and recently arrived in Ethiopia. He planned for Ethiopia to be a way station, a stopover on his way to Europe. He knew the risks of northward migration could include torture, slavery, death, kidnapping, winding up as a refugee or an asylum seeker back in this camp or in another camp, but still he planned to move on. Then he arrived in the camp and had a few surprises. When he came, he was drawn into government and NGO-sponsored programs that were designed to slow onward movement and migration. He was hired to do work for a small amount of incentive pay with an aid organization. He was volunteering to tutor children, and he successfully passed the matriculation exam with the help of an NGO tutoring program, which earned him a scholarship to attend university in Ethiopia. And yet, still, despite his relative success, and his excitement about the possibility of a university education, Habtum was haunted by the specter of falling into what he called the empty time of the camp. He was so terrified of getting stuck and all the problems that come with being stuck that he was not yet willing to abandon his goal of northward migration. He described this as a choice, and he surprised us at the end of our interview with him by saying, "My dream is so many things. What should I choose?" In a few minutes, I'm going to ask you, what would you choose if you were in Habtum's shoes? But while you think about that, let me give you a little bit of context for our book. We began fieldwork in summer 2016, which was an optimistic moment, we thought, or so we hoped. Around that same time, Ethiopia was taking center stage as a co-host with the United States of a leaders' assembly on refugees and migrants in New York. The UN General Assembly had called for a summit of world leaders in an effort to create a more global coordination around refugee and migration management. To this end, the 2016 Refugee Summit and the subsequent global compacts on refugees and migrations, which came out of that summit, placed a strong emphasis on migration management through changing the nature of refugee hosting in the global south, with support from wealthy countries in the north. In summer 2017, Filippo Grandi praised Ethiopian hospitality as a refugee hosting state. Ethiopia was not alone in receiving praise. He said almost the same thing in Jordan and in Djibouti. And Uganda was also long praised for its particular role as a hosting state. So what was this about? And what did it mean for refugees for this new emphasis to be placed on hosting in the South? Ethiopia's role in the New York Summit is part of a broader set of initiatives in countries that have long been host to large populations of refugees. And in case people don't know, the vast majority of refugees are hosted in a very small number of countries throughout the global South, with tiny Lebanon carrying far more of its weight. Uganda has been a huge refugee host. Kenya has been a long-term refugee host. In the North, we often think of refugees as sort of all coming here, when that's actually just not the case. Most refugees are not here. So The shift in paradigms was to sort of figure out how can we make these hosting states better places for refugees to stay long term. This shift was manifested through something that's been called a humanitarian development nexus. This nexus emphasizes local integration through the fusion of a fused service delivery between humanitarian service delivery and development service delivery. It emphasizes local integration rather than repatriation or resettlement as the most prominent durable solution. The three so-called durable solutions have long been thought of as the three ends to a refugee's journey: resettlement, repatriation, or local integration. And local integration around this time suddenly was the thing that everyone was talking about. People referred to it as the forgotten durable solution. Unfortunately, local integration is not particularly durable. We'd also argue that this approach de-emphasizes protection of refugees and rolls back many of the rights that are enshrined in international law that refugees are supposed to have, and instead configures them as developmental and economic actors. But there's another piece of the shift that we want to emphasize. We argue in our book that this is not just a humanitarian development nexus, but a humanitarian development security nexus, with security referring to safeguarding the borders of the North by preventing migration. So we think of it as a sort of offshoring of migration deterrence. Offshoring of migration deterrence are things like, for example, what's happening in Mexico now, where people have to process asylum claims offshore outside of the country. Further offshoring are the forms of deterrence that start even further away. Much of the conversation in Ethiopia around this time revolved around 9 pledges that Ethiopia made at the 2016 summit, which is where signatories from around the world made lots of pledges. Ethiopia's pledges included expanding an out-of-camp program, which was a program that actually was started for Eritrean refugees who often had family connections in Ethiopia, where they could move out of camps if they could show that they had someone to support them. Ways for refugees to more easily acquire documents, which was a really important measure. Opportunities for refugees to acquire work permits, which was possibly the most promising element of the pledges and the one that actually never really materialized. A path to citizenship for some of the longest standing refugees, access to land for certain categories of refugees, and expanded access to education, including university education, which was a big part of what we wound up looking at in our study. The pledges remained promises for a long time. Although they were eventually voted into law in Ethiopia in 2019, so that was 2016 to 2019 until it became law. The law was immediately followed up with some procedural documents that effectively rendered the law sort of in a way that refugees actually couldn't access some of these things. So they had to go through so much bureaucracy to get work permits that very, very few people have been able to secure work permits. So they were still inaccessible. Refugees we talked to believed that the pledges from the beginning would turn out to be false promises, even before they were voted into law. The slow rollout of the pledges was a particular concern and created a great sense of distrust in refugees, which turned out to be well-founded, that the pledges would actually ever be able to change anything for them. To understand the effect of the pledges, we have to consider what policy looks like, not just from the vantage point of refugees. We think that these policies are mired in a spatial and sedentarist bias, the idea of getting refugees to a safe place. Getting to a safe place is what the durable solutions are all about. But from the vantage point of refugees, using a temporal lens served to be much more important. If we use a temporal lens to look at the pledges, it changes our view of refugee hosting and migration. It reveals how pledges overall and these policy trends towards local integration generate particular kinds of temporal suffering and temporal violence. So just a quick word about our methodology. Amanda and I are both ethnographers. Amanda is an ecological anthropologist. I'm a political and educational anthropologist. We both have a long-time focus in our work on Eritrea. We set out to see how these emerging policies related to local integration were actually experienced by refugees. Much of our work took place in 3 refugee camps in northern Ethiopia, in the Tigray region. We also interviewed people in urban centers and did interviews and focus groups on various university campuses in Aksum and in Addis Ababa. We also did key stakeholder interviews with NGOs, UNHCR, ARA, which is the Ethiopian body responsible for managing refugees. And perhaps most importantly, we had several interlocutors who we interviewed over time and we maintained long-term relationships with. I want to return to Haptom's dilemma before we jump into the interactive portion of this talk, to talk a little bit about our theoretical orientation of the book. Haptom was facing an acute dilemma. Why leave a safe place and the chance to further his education, knowing the horrific risks of irregular migration? We came to understand that risk doesn't only lie in irregular migration. It was also risky to stay in Ethiopia for many reasons. One major one had to do with the experience of time. Ethnographic work has increasingly focused on temporality as essential to understanding the lived experiences of displaced people. Janssen's concept of distimement highlights displacement as not only spatial, but temporal. Life for displaced people is often described as one of stuckness, although recently scholars have called for unsticking stuckness and understanding stuckness as a dynamic condition that refugees are constantly trying to get themselves out of, and stuckness is sort of constantly coming for them. Elizabeth Dunn writes about the chronic present and what she calls the zone of temporal indistinction when time drags, is emptied of meaningful activities and disconnected from a planful future. We came to think of this as time emptied of telos. Telos is time oriented towards a particular end, so time emptied of its ability to reach an end. Time emptied of momentum toward a goal or the possibility of progress. A focus on temporality also allows us to explore futurity among refugees. Cosmologies of future return are one way that refugees frame decisions about how the present is lived, as Lisa Malki told us in her really influential study years ago on refugees. More recently, Georgina Ramsey has explored cosmologies in crisis when there are radical ruptures to the familiar daily rhythms of life. And Melanie Bologna, who studies Eritrean migrants, explores what she calls cosmologies of destinations, which produce and are produced by desires for places where time will move differently, where different types of futures can exist. As we'll see in a moment, education is not a way to escape these temporal dilemmas. Sarah Dryden Peterson has argued that refugee education must contend with education for a, quote, unknowable future. But what do refugees do in the face of this unknowable future? What about temporal agency of refugees in the face of stuckness and temporal suffering? How do refugees take agency over their futures? What happens when there's a disconnect between refugees' experiences and aspirations and the humanitarian and migration management policies that gave shape to our project? So now we get to jump into the fun part, I hope. So I'm going to return to Haptom's choice. And I'm going to ask you to be a character in this sort of interactive scenario. The you is a composite of many refugees that we spoke with over the course of our research, including Haptom. And this next piece is structured around a series of choices that Haptom and others were faced with. All of these are based on real scenarios. And I should also add that I'll sort of zoom out of the scenarios that I'm following you through to explain some theoretical points or to give examples from other refugee stories as well as we go through this. So just to reiterate the choice I'm going to ask you to make, and we can go back and make different choices. We can follow multiple pathways. First, migration, which, as I already explained, has extremely dire risks, but gives you a sense of control, agency, a sense of doing something. Waiting in the camp, which no one wants, and is sort of the greatest specter for many refugees of something that they're afraid of. Waiting, being stuck is everyone's fear. But I should also add that there was a false but constant refrain of, if you're in the camp, you have a greater chance of being resettled. So many refugees opted to wait in the camp because they were waiting for resettlement. And that false information circulated very frequently. Or Haptom's third choice, your third choice, you could go to university. At this point, you cannot work legally in Ethiopia. So after you finish university, it's not clear whether you'll get a job. There's a few jobs in the informal economy, but most of them are very low paying. And you also don't have the ability to go on to a further degree after you get your first year of university degree. So it may be a dead end. So what would you choose? I'll also add that the reason I put these three choices in conversation with each other is because refugees themselves constantly were putting these three spaces and the three temporalities associated with these three spaces, the camp and the stuckness of the camp, education, particularly university education, and the teleological time associated with that, and migration and the sort of unknown distant future associated with migrating. Those three things were constantly in conversation with each other and being weighed as sort of, these are three different pathways And people never just made one choice. They made one choice and then switched around. So someone want to volunteer? What choice should we make? Anyone can call out something. We could take a vote. Let's vote. All right, who votes for migration? All right, so we've got 4 for migration. Who votes for camp? 3 for camp. And who votes for university? All right, you can tell where we are right now. All right, now I have to find my, whoops, that's not where we gotta go. I'm still learning how to use this clicker. No. Okay, there we go. All right, university. Now I have to find my university slide here. All right, you go to university. At first, you are so happy to be learning. Eritrea closed its only university years ago and replaced it with technical colleges that you could only access after going through years and years of military service. Having the chance to go to a university means a great deal to you. But there are so many challenges that you find once you get there. You and the other refugee students arrive several months late for your classes because the refugee matriculation exam is given much later than the rest of the countries. So you're behind from the beginning. On top of that, English, which you speak, is supposed to be the language of instruction in universities, but all the professors only speak Amharic, which you have not yet mastered. You've always wanted to be a nurse, but because you arrive late, you're assigned to the Faculty of Education. You were a teacher in Eritrea by force. You didn't enjoy being a teacher. You've always felt a calling to medical practices, to the medical field. But you don't get to choose your own field of study. The worst part of all of this is that you don't know how you're supposed to live or how you're supposed to eat. ARA, the Ethiopian body responsible for you, provides you with a very modest stipend, but they're always late in sending it, and it's never enough. You come from a poor family and have no remittances from anyone. You realize that most of the other refugee university students have people out of the country sending them money. How are you supposed to eat? How do you afford making photocopies of the readings that you're supposed to do? How do you live? These dilemmas illuminate the vast disjunctures between the temporalities of education and the temporalities of humanitarianism. Education is largely teleological and based on a particular modernist telos, the march towards progress. The idea that if you structure your time, your day, your week, your semester, your year correctly with discipline, if you work hard and do well, you will arrive at the achieved end. This is often really familiar to all of us in an institution of education because we've all been living it for many, many years. This is sort of the basic temporality of education in general. But in contrast, humanitarian temporalities are slow, late, and belated. Refugees are on a different timeline. Stipends arrive late, students arrive late. They're disadvantaged by this temporality. They also feel disrespected by these slow temporalities and by not being taken seriously as students. We heard a story many times while we were doing research in the camp about a suit. One refugee said that he was supposed to do a presentation for his senior project, and he needed to wear a suit for the presentation. ARA agreed that he should have a suit and agreed to give him funding for the suit, but they were late in giving him the funding, and he couldn't find money to buy a suit anywhere else. So he had to give his presentation in a borrowed suit that didn't fit very well. This was a tremendous source of shame for him. And it illustrates the disjunctures between education and humanitarian temporalities and the way these disjunctures psychologically and materially disadvantage refugees. And this was obviously of great importance because different people kept telling us this story over and over and over to illustrate how they can't get ahead in education, how the temporalities work against them. Refugees are also outright discriminated against. Ends that they worked hard for were denied them. They repeatedly said that they could not receive awards for top students, even if they were one of the top students. And they were denied the opportunity to work as TAs or tutors for their professors, even if they had the grades that would warrant that. The ends promised them at the end of the educational telos were denied them. These are some components of what we call teleological violence. Teleological violence shows up in high schools as well, where the sign pictured on the screen showed up. A banner over the school director's office read, "The future is in school today." A painted metal sign standing outside the school compound quoted Nelson Mandela and said, "Education is the only powerful weapon to change the world." Taken together, these two statements link the school with the present and the future, teleological time. The belief that education aligns the present with the future, brings out a positive change, is perhaps as old as formal schooling itself. But the school enrollment rates tell a different story of those, and tells a story of failed promises for refugees. As you can see on the other side of the screen, over here, is a hand-drawn bar chart. In brown, these are the numbers of refugee students in the school going back to 2010. And in red are the number of local students. This was a school that had both students from the local town and refugees as well. So these are, so whoops. Oh, sorry, my notes went to the wrong place. This is what happens when I'm trying to do C6. Anyway, I'll just look there. Anyway, so as you can see, there was a disjuncture between, there was a difference between the number of national students and the overall students in the school was going up, while the number of refugee students was steadily going down. The number of refugee students precipitously dropped in 2014. We asked ourselves, we kept asking it again and again, why was the number of refugee students so low? The camp was full. The camp was full of school-aged children. So we kept asking this question, and finally we got an answer. Why, if education was a powerful weapon, were refugees not in school? 2014, the year which saw the steepest drop, was the year of the Lampedusa boat crash. Do people remember Lampedusa boat crash? It was certainly not the last or the first or the most deadly of the boat crashes in the Mediterranean, but it was covered a lot by the media, and so it sort of captured the international imagination. What was less covered was the fact that a large percentage of the refugees on that boat were Eritrean, and many of them came from this particular camp in Ethiopia. Back in the Mayaini camp, people were outraged about this, and they blamed policies of refugee governance for the fact that so many people had died. They blamed not having enough rations. They blamed not having enough resettlement opportunities. And they suggested that this was why so many people had migrated and why they had died in that boat. So that's just an interesting connection that people were making, that people will wait for resettlement if they know they can be resettled and they won't have to take that risk. People will, if they have enough to eat and they can live in the camp, they won't have to take that risk. So they're directly connecting migration with conditions in the camp and with other future possibilities. Anyway, people in the camp protested, demanding more rations, demanding more resettlement opportunities, and the Ethiopian government clamped down brutally on these protests, which in turn led to another wave of mass migration and a general increase in lack of trust for Ethiopian governance of refugees. One refugee told us they had hope before. After that, the government and the UNHCR told them, you will live your life in this camp. We think that they had decided at that point to create their own hope by migrating. All right, so we'll return to your choices. Despite all these challenges, you're managing to do well in university. An organization called ERUSA, the Eritrean Refugee University Students Association, meets regularly to advocate for refugee needs and support each other. You pool your money to make it through the tough times. You share photocopies so that you can study. And some representatives of the organization meet with the dean to advocate for leniency from professors to accommodate your lateness and your language struggles. After a few months, you get word that your father in Eritrea is sick and needs an operation. Your family can't afford it, and there's a chance your father will die. A smuggler hears about your predicament and approaches you and says he could get you to Europe even without any money. You could pay him when you arrive. You know the risks of migrating. You know there's a chance that your choice to migrate might fail. You also know that there's no chance you can help your father if you stay in university. You feel really guilty studying. Studying is a privilege while your father is dying and your family is suffering. What do you choose this time? Should we take a vote again? Stay in university? Keep studying? Anyone vote for that? Migrate? All right, wow, okay. I have to find my cursor and make it work. There we go. Now I have to find my migration slide. You contact a smuggler and make your way to Europe. Habtom, who we started with, eventually migrated as well, although it wasn't his first choice. He actually went to the university first. You're both lucky and unlucky. On your first try, you're caught and returned to the camp. You spent all your money to pay that first smuggler, and you don't have any money to leave now. And you've squandered your chance to go to the university by dropping out. But this only makes you more determined to migrate again, which Habtom actually did. You contact a smuggler who will take payment later when you arrive and get a job and begin your journey. This next smuggler that you contact was completely unscrupulous, as many are who promise that they'll take payment later. He sells you to people who detained you and held you for ransom. We heard from other refugees and NGO staff that Habtom actually had been kidnapped by smugglers and was being held in what they called a terrible place. From there, his story becomes vague. When he next got in contact with Amanda and I, he had actually been relocated to a refugee camp in Niger, and he was eventually resettled and relocated to Germany. The sign on the slide reads in Tigrinya, "Illegal migration is covering our eyes and exposing ourselves to danger. Let's know, let's pay attention, let's respect ourselves." Despite a wide array of programs geared towards making refugees aware of the risks of migration, including the campaign that this image was a part of, we found that refugees were well aware of these risks, and the campaign did little to discourage refugees from migrating. To understand why so many refugees make such a risky decision, it's important to understand why temporalities of extreme risk come to seem logical. Migration is obviously incredibly dangerous, and I've already listed many of the reasons why many of the things that people can happen, and refugees kept telling us again and again that they were very aware of what these risks might be. The possibility of making the choice to migrate, despite its risk, is a pressure refugees are constantly under, and they talk about it as a constant temptation, as something an option that's constantly there for them. It never goes away. Part of this pressure comes from the strain of empty time, or time that does not move in the camp. Part of this pressure comes from wanting to be able to take agency over your future and not being able to do that in the camp. Taking the risk of migration is one way that refugees claim temporal agency over the future. This form of risk-taking, we argue, requires, quote, evacuating the near future, borrow Jane Geyer's phrasing, and instead looking to the distant future, a future not connected to the near future, a future in which the present attaches to a time arrived at through faith rather than reason. This desire for a distant future structures decisions, enables risks to be taken, but it can also enable waiting. So the same kind of temporality can enable refugees, if they think they might be resettled, to wait in the camp for long periods of time. If we get to it, there's also all kinds of other forms of distant future making, which got really interesting and really creative, which I hope I have the chance to talk about. So effectively, this form of temporality means you don't know where you're going, but you know you're on your way, as the sign says from this bar that was located in the Maiaini refugee camp. This is similar also to what Kallio and co-authors call radical hope, or as we might paraphrase it, hope when hope does not exist, does not seem logical. Hope when there's no hope, apparently, but hope also when you have no choice but to hope. So this is a way to think about the future when there aren't very many other choices, but still give yourself agency over the future, which can result in risk, but can also result in waiting if waiting is seen as having an end. All right, so now we're back to our beginning phase. We've seen the migration route. We've seen the university route. Should we give the camp route a try? Oops, I forgot to advance that one. I don't do very well with multiple technologies. You stay in the camp, and many things go well for you initially. Remember, we're back to Habtom's initial choice where he decides to stay in the camp. Many things go well for you initially. You work for an NGO that does trauma counseling for refugees. It doesn't pay much for a professional job, only incentive wages. And incentive wages are wages that refugees are required to be paid if they're in the camp, and sometimes even if they're urban refugees. They're very low wages, especially when they're being given for professional jobs. And in my opinion, there's really absolutely no reason for them besides to artificially depress refugee wages and not pay them what they're worth. A similar thing happens between international NGO wages and national staff, who also have artificially low sort of salary bands created. So you have these sort of hierarchies of salaries. This was not what our research was about, but it comes up again and again. And it's important to say that you had sometimes high-level professional people who were being paid well below the market value for their work simply because they were refugees. Anyway, so you're doing work for incentive work, but it's meaningful work, so it's worth it. And you feel like you're getting some new skills. You also become a community leader, serving as a representative on the Refugee Coordinating Committee. This is unpaid work, and it's hard. You often have a long line of refugees outside the small shed you use for an office. People ask you for permission to leave the camp. They ask you for a replacement ration card. They ask you for permission to join the out-of-camp program. You have power to give them none of these things. All you can do is make a recommendation to ARA. This frustrates you, and you often want to quit. Although you're doing okay, life is a constant struggle against depression and the emptiness of time in the camp. You try to focus on what's meaningful, but are faced on a daily basis with the futility of everything. Then the NGO you're working for loses its funding, and you no longer have that job. Your term on the Refugee Coordinating Committee ends, to your relief. You consider going to university, but people keep telling you that your chances at being resettled are stronger in the camp than in school. This is not true, but it's a common perception. You do your best to stay hopeful and focus on making the community better. What you face is all too common. Many refugees struggle with empty time in the camp, succumbing to drinking, depression, hopelessness. Many refuse to succumb by migrating immediately. Some go to school, either high school or university, as a means to combat empty time. We'll hopefully talk later about particular forms of temporal violence that were faced when refugees were in camp, but also the way refugees use care as a palliative measure against the dangers of empty time. We'll see that we think of care as a form of time making, a form of making time in the present meaningful, a form of temporal agency that allowed refugees to fill empty time with something meaningful. But the problem with temporal caretaking is that it exists in a symbiotic relationship with various forms of temporal suffering. You wouldn't need to have to do this temporal caretaking if the empty time of the present wasn't there. Endless waiting is also a component of this, and the depression and malaise that comes with empty time is a part of this as well. Thank you. That's perfect. All right, so in this scenario, you also have bad news from home if you stay in the camp, where you're faced with the choice. You have a sick father. What do? Do you want to migrate on? Do you want to keep waiting in the camp? Because we're getting short on time. We've already sort of seen where the migration pathway ends. So I'm going to suggest that we stay in the camp at this point. So we keep waiting in the camp. You decide to wait in the camp. You fall into a deeper depression. You're worried about your father. You begin drinking. You might have wound up like one of our interlocutors who we call Anda Burhan. He had what he called a special job as a librarian in one of the camps. But the strain of life and stresses back home led him to drink. And while drunk, he insulted another NGO staff and lost his job, deepening his depression even more. But in your effort to combat your malaise, you do a couple of other things. You get a loan to start a store. The store, like all stores in refugee camps, had no hope of being a financial success. There are so many stores in refugee camps. Someone told us in one of the camps there was one store for every 5 refugees. Additionally, refugees have to get goods at a much higher price, so they have to raise their prices. People from the nearby towns tend to not shop in refugee camps, but refugees shop in the towns, so they tend to go to towns to shop. Anyway, stores are not very lucrative. But the store is a place of sociability, and running it gives you a purpose and makes you happy. After some time, you start to notice severely mentally ill people disturbing others and receiving no care in the camp. Since Eritrean refugees are fleeing the traumas associated with life under dictatorship, and many are victims of torture, there are many severely mentally ill people in the camp. One night, you round them up and house them in an empty structure at the edge of camp. Later, you receive support from the Orthodox Church in the camp and set up a nicer place for them to be, which eventually becomes a sort of center for these people. You find meaning in supporting this population. But the center you started has no funding and no professional staff. You've asked several NGOs if they would fund it, and UNHCR, and no one will fund it because it's not official. You persist. You remain in the camp for years, experiencing ups and downs, doing what you can to make the camp a better place, waiting, hoping for resettlement. In summer 2018, Ethiopia's new prime minister brokers a peace agreement with Eritrea. You're very concerned that this hasty peace agreement will result in the border opening. If the border opens, you worry, Eritrean forces or agents will be allowed to access the camps, and refugees might be forcibly repatriated or victimized. Since you openly criticize the Eritrean government, you know you would be at risk if anyone from the Eritrean government had access to the camp. There are many like you in the camp. Through your contacts and leveraging your role as a former RCC rep, you set up a meeting with UNHCR. This is not easy to do. UNHCR officials assure you that the border will not open overnight, and they will take necessary measures to protect refugees. But the border does open abruptly later that summer, and then closes a few months later. The situation remains strained and strange in Northern Ethiopia, eventually erupting in a war in November 2020, incidentally on election night in the United States. Eritrea is heavily involved in the war. 2 of the camps, including the one you live in, are on the front lines of the war and eventually close. 2 of the other camps are destroyed, and accounts later tell us that Eritrean forces did come into those camps and repatriated many refugees, which is exactly what you feared. We don't know what happened to you during the war. So now we've seen several of these different pathways. How much time do we have? About 5 minutes. Do you want to break for questions, or do you want to try another set of scenarios? What's that? More scenarios? Okay. I think we can go to a few other scenarios if we go to the university option. All right, so we've already seen university education. We've seen the keep studying. Okay, let's go with that one. All right, so remember back here, you get bad news from home. Do you migrate? We chose migration. Or you can choose to keep studying. So keep studying. You stay in school. ERUSA, the Eritrean Refugee University Student Association, is really instrumental in enabling you to do this. Not only does ERUSA meet regularly to advocate for refugee needs and support each other, your ERUSA friends also convince you that your father would really want you to stay in school. So a little bit more about ERUSA. We considered ERUSA a key means of countering what we call teleological violence, the violence that is caused by the ends of education that are promised and never realized, by trying to reclaim refugees' right for teleological time, their right for progress. So let me tell you a little bit more about them. ERUSA was a grassroots organization that formed through the initiative of Eritrean refugee university students in 2015. You can see the words of some of its founders. Whoops, I didn't advance, whoops. It's hard when I have to think to advance in 2 different places. My brain doesn't work that way. You can see the words of some of their founders on the screen. One of the things that to flag is that for ERUSA, pairing education and migration together in a different way and recoupling that differently was a really important thing to do. So one of the things that they tried to do, in addition to advocating within universities, for refugees to talk to deans, to advocate for the needs of refugees, to pool money so that refugees would have some mutual aid and support for each other, was that they also started projects back in the camps where they were working with youth and students and young people in the camps to try to convince them to go to school instead of to migrate on. They were trying to hold themselves up as effectively a role model for what it could look like if refugees became educated rather than what it would look like for refugees to migrate, because there were so many role models of refugees who had migrated, some who had migrated successfully, and they thought of this as sort of a negative role model because so many people would not succeed in that journey. So they were trying to kind of reclaim teleological violence and say this pathway can work for you, and to put that out to young people, to tutor them, and mostly to build relationships and convince them that they could use the educational pathway. All right, so you stay, going back to your choices, after using ERUSA's support and engaging in university, you managed to stay in university for 2 more years. But each year you feel increasingly frustrated with the university. You don't see the point in what you're learning. The knowledge that you're learning feels dead and disconnected from the world. You want to change the world. You want to invent things. You want to be an entrepreneur. Your professors have no interest in supporting your imagination. Tony Stark, Iron Man's alias, and Elon Musk are your role models. And you're frustrated by not being able to earn money. You don't think you'll ever be able to earn money as a refugee. You begin learning about Bitcoin and starting to figure out how to attract Bitcoin investors in Ethiopia so that you can start Bitcoin mining. This brings in money, a good amount of money initially. You're considering dropping out of school to continue with your Bitcoin business. What would you choose? Who votes for university? Who votes for Bitcoin? All right, show of hands for Bitcoin. It's an interesting dilemma, right? All right, so we got how many for university? Oh, gee, I think the university wins it. Sorry, guys. I can tell you a little bit later what happens to the Bitcoin. All right, your friends convince you to stay in university, and it's a good thing too, because the Bitcoin business failed because it's actually illegal in Ethiopia and there's no way to connect to international markets. It was sort of looking more like a pyramid scheme than Bitcoin trading and mining. So you continue, you work hard, you get to graduation. All right, so now you graduated. What will you do next? Now you have a huge decision to make. Do you move to Addis Ababa, the capital, where you might be able to get work in the informal economy, working for a private school or private clinic or something? But you won't have any assistance from Mara. So you really have to, without the ability to legally work, you really have to make it on your own. Or do you go back to the camp where you'll have assistance, but you'll be completely stuck? Refugees still can't work legally in Ethiopia, only through the informal economy. And likely, if you move to Addis Ababa, you'll live in a condo that's not in very good shape in the outskirts of town. Your commute will be long, transportation costs are high. You'll probably have to share a room with lots of other people. So it's going to be hard. It's going to be a hard life. It might be impossible to live. But did you come this far in order to just go back to the camp where you started from? So what would you choose? Move to Addis Ababa or go back to the camp? How many people move to Addis Ababa? And how many people go back to the camp? Okay, lots of people move to Addis Ababa. So if you move to Addis Ababa, you might wind up like a refugee who we call Guerrier. He was lucky. He got a job teaching in a private school through some connections at his church. He was married, and his wife also was lucky to be able to get some informal work. But he worked extremely long hours, and he was frustrated because he was getting paid way less than his Ethiopian colleagues. He eventually had 2 kids, then his wife couldn't work, and then things became more difficult. He was effectively working around the clock. But Guerrier was still lucky. In many ways, he was the educated refugee success story. But his life was extraordinarily hard. He had some business ideas, also struggled with having family members who were ill, who he had to then support, so his business didn't work eventually. And he kept trying, similar to refugees in the camp, he kept trying different things, and they kept not working. Guerrier was extremely lucky. He eventually got a scholarship to study abroad, and is still currently trying to reunify with his family, who are still trying to make ends meet in Addis Ababa. Oops, that's not where we want to go. Right, sequencing is a little bit off here. Guerrier might have, if you moved to the camp, you might have, if you moved to Addis Ababa, you might have also wound up like another refugee who we call Berihu, who initially tried his hand at living outside of camps, but like so many who tried to live in Addis Ababa or elsewhere in Ethiopia, just can't make it and eventually find themselves back in the camp. Sorry, I need to get my notes working and my computer doesn't want to cooperate with me. All right. After graduating near the top of his class, Berihu just couldn't afford to live outside of the camp. So he found himself back in the camp. And this is what I'd like you to put yourself in the scenario. So you find yourself back in the camp, subsisting on rations and incentive pay. Your story, Berihu told us that, quote, a graduate is living for 3 years, useless. After graduation, I returned to where I was, just sleeping and sitting. He falls into a depression like so many others. He stops, quote, acting like a teacher, showed up for class late and unkempt. He described his job as simply killing time. He eventually righted himself through caring for others. And he started working with other university graduates to design programs to encourage youth to stay in school. He also tried his hand at farming, as you can see pictured here. He was trying as hard as he could to make time move. He tried to start a bar and a business. He was working really hard, doing whatever he could to sort of care for his community, care for the present. When we were talking with him at his bar and his farm one day, actually an Ethiopian from the countryside came up and actually asked him for money, and he gave money. So he's even caring for his Ethiopian host community in a lot of ways. But whatever he did seemed doomed to failure by no fault of his own. The soil was full of rocks, which he very diligently took the rocks out of the soil. But he knew that because this was an illegal farm, that ARA or UNHCR could take it away from him at any time. His business failed because there was no consistent electricity in the camp, and he couldn't run a refrigerator. He then opened another smaller shop closer to the center of the camp, and that also failed. Berryhu's experience illuminate the intertwined relationship between temporal suffering and empty time in the camp and caretaking. He was constantly trying to do things to keep himself up, to arrive somewhere, and he was constantly thwarted with all of the efforts to do this. He said that helping others makes your mind rest, but it was also a constant reminder of the emptiness of time and the interminable present in the camp. His garden, his farm, was a source of pride, but was also a constant reminder that everything could be taken away. All right, one last choice, and then we'll probably break off at that point. So you're in the camp. You continue to struggle with life in the camp. You continue working with Arusa, which continues to kind of keep you out of depression because it's meaningful work. Your classmates who have moved to the cities return to help you with a project to work with youth and encourage them not to migrate. It's good to see your classmates when they come back from the city, but it hurts a little bit. One day, one of your classmates who has been living outside of the camp brings some shocking news to you. There's a refugee who you consider to have been a mentor to you, someone who was a role model that helped you not migrate and stay in the camp and go to school. You've just heard that this individual who meant so much to you has actually migrated on. This news shocks you. It sort of breaks down everything that you thought you believed. You're discouraged. It pulls you into crisis. This makes you think that maybe you should have taken the risk and migrated years ago. This makes you rethink everything. So we could choose migration now, and we know where that path leads. And the point of this is just to say that there's hopefully you get the point by the recurring slide of migration that that's a constant option, that when family members are sick, when someone else migrates, especially someone who's been meaningful to you and been a role model to not migrate, it can change everything for you. So that's a constant pressure. And this was a moment of crisis. Still, oops, sorry, I didn't include my slide. Still, let's assume that Berryhu decides to wait again. So choose to wait or migration. So choose to wait. So you choose to wait again, but waiting is getting much, much harder every time. So waiting and the constant sort of temptation of migration, I think, speaks to the power of teleological violence. I don't know if you can see the quotation on the screen, but these are some quotations from educated refugees who wound up back in the camps or wound up struggling, unable to meet the desired ends of education. They say, 4 years ago, I graduated, I have an asset, but if you have a big asset, it will drive you, it's like a virus, it will drive you crazy. We've gone to school, we've followed classes, we blame ourselves. Why did I go to school? Why didn't I try to solve that problem for myself? Insinuating by migrating. We are visionless. What we are going to do, we don't know. We are visionless. We learn here and go to camp. What will I be later? Nothing. I will be the same as those who are not educated. If you always give food, it is not good. You need to teach Amanda fish, so we need change. We don't have a chance to do anything. The chance to study is both a curse and a blessing. Outside the university, there's no future. When we come here to the camp, we are incentive workers. They, Ethiopian counterparts, are getting 7,000 birr, and we are getting 700. Everybody is giving up, disheartened. Where is the good thing the government is doing for us? They gave us a chance to learn. We come back. We are nurses, but making nothing. So all of this epitomizes the stresses and strains of reaching for education and then constantly being thwarted. So I think that's a good place to end, and I'm probably just about at time. Is that right? Great. I think we worked through most of our scenarios. I would love your feedback on whether this interactive format worked, whether a more linear format would work. I know it was a little glitchy at points. I'll have to work that out, but I know I enjoyed working with this. And if there's any scenarios that you feel like I didn't have the chance to follow, I'd be happy to tell you what those are like.
Hi, I'm Sandra Bell. I teach in African American Studies. I don't have a question about these things here because it's obvious for all the universe. But I do have a question. It's just